Venga.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Today we have the pleasure to have our friend and colleague Sergio Sastre to discuss about the topic of his thesis. He will talk about resource extraction, trade, and waste management, a regional approach to the Spanish socioeconomic metabolism. We've been working together with Sergio for long. He is truly our data cruncher at ENT, and he's an expert on material flow accounting. He's got both a theoretical and practical knowledge of the mechanisms involving material flow accounting. He also knows the statistical instruments used by Eurostat and other official institutions. And we are very happy that he finally is about to finalize his thesis. He has been, I think, working on it since we know him. So finally, Sergio, congratulations. And the floor is yours. You have around 40 minutes, and this would allow around 20 minutes for discussion. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ignacy. Please, I would ask somebody to remind me how I'm doing about time, because I cannot see the clock in my screen now. So if you can go tell me, like, have 30 minutes, 20 minutes every 10 minutes, for example, it would be okay. Okay, I'm Sergio Sastre. I'm a researcher and consultant at ENT. And this presentation is about my thesis, which is about to be finished and presented, and hopefully very soon. The title is Resource Extraction, Trade and Waste Management, a regional approach to the Spanish socioeconomic metabolism. My advisors are Oscar Carpintero and Jordi Roca, and I'm doing this thesis since forever at ICTA at the Autónoma University of Barcelona. Okay. The contents will be a brief introduction to the thesis, then the core of the thesis are 3 chapters, and then we have brief conclusions as well. I will not go in detail, and I will try to focus on the main points, and feel free to ask once we finish the presentation, because it's a lot of contents, and I'm aware it's going to be difficult to process, and perhaps some things caught your attention, so note it down and we can discuss that later. Okay. Chapter 1 of my thesis is the introduction, and I address how this intellectual race we have been running for a couple of centuries now, and more intensely since the 60s, perhaps, on reintroducing Homo sapiens within the limits of the biosphere. So the Homo sapiens is extracting and processing resources at a pace that it might not be sustainable, as we know, in terms of scarcity from the input side, and in terms of biosphere absorption, in terms of CO2, for example, and also other kind of wastes and emissions. There are a lot of metaphors or conceptual frameworks that allow for researchers to frame this issue of reintroducing Homo sapiens within the limits of the biosphere. And one of these useful metaphors is what we call social metabolism, which is assuming that socio-ecological systems are life systems in which you need some inputs to feed this metabolism, and as a result of this metabolism, you have wastes and emissions. So socioeconomic systems, we assume that they extract resources. These resources are transformed to provide a certain level of goods and services, and following the laws of thermodynamics, these resources eventually become wastes and emissions, which are sent back to the biosphere, which is supposed to be processing it and converted into something useful to us again. Socioeconomic systems, under this metaphor, should maintain an overarching resource consumption pattern that allows for renewable resources to recover. For example, forests, you cannot destroy forests at a pace that that makes the forest not to recover again because you don't have that resource after that, while conserving the biosphere capacity to provide non-renewable resources and absorb wastes and emission at a level where human life is feasible and I add, hopefully, enjoyable. Well, within this metaphor and this conceptual framework we use in social metabolism, we have some quantitative tools. And one of these tools is economy-wide material flow accounts, which is the one I use in my thesis in order to make the accounts of the metabolism of the Spanish regions, the Spanish autonomous communities. Derived from this framework and from this quantitative tool, we have some indicators and we can follow the performance of the regions or the nations or the whole planet according to these indicators. One important thing about this methodology and this quantitative tool is that it is mainly applied at national level. So the focus tends to be nations, Spain, or groups of nations like the European Union, for example. The scheme is very simple, apparently, and it has an input side where you have materials that are extracted in your territory. For example, if you're in Catalonia, material extracted from Catalonia, and imports from other places, from other socioeconomic systems. Then they go through the economy, and a part of these materials are accumulated in the form of stocks, okay, stocks of material. And as the law of thermodynamics says, a part of this become emissions, waste disposal, etc., and another part are exports to other socioeconomic systems. So how do I contribute to this whole scheme of social metabolism? Well, we have to consider that most of these studies or studies applying these methodologies are focused at national level, which means that we don't know what is happening within nations. We don't know. That's a black box at the moment. So there is, on one side, a subnational gap. So we don't know what is, as I said, what is happening within nations. We don't know what is happening in Andalusia. We don't know what is happening in the state of Oklahoma in the United States. And this is also related to other contribution I'm doing with my thesis, which is there is a very well-established and harmonized methodology for addressing nations with this methodology, but this methodology has to be changed and has to be adapted to the subnational, to the regional context, and this creates a methodological gap because you have to make additional decisions and you have to build up different methodologies in order to compile and make it comparable to national accounts. So this thesis addresses these two gaps: the gap of the geographic scope on one hand, and the methodological gap that emerges from this objective. And I chose the case of Spain, besides because I live in Spain, because the subnational scale is very relevant in Spain in administrative terms, as it is, for example, in Germany or in the United Kingdom or in the US. Also because there is poor data availability and there are a lot of data gaps and inconsistencies that can be identified by doing these kind of exercises that, by the way, are quite data intensive. And because the data series I address in my thesis is 1996, to 2010. So there is an exceptional character of this period in Spain, particularly due to the housing bubble. Just a little bit of background. I have found only 27 papers or studies on material flows at regional level, of which 11 are focused on Spain and published by friends of mine. Of this, if we narrow the scope and go to an exercise similar of the one I'm doing in my thesis, which is addressing the whole of the nation, the 17 autonomous communities of Spain, there are only 3 peer-reviewed studies on this issue, which are China, mine from Spain, and the Czech Republic. So this kind of studies are really scarce in the literature, and so we can confirm that there is a huge gap. The objectives are the following. I try to identify the available data sources and gaps for the compilation of material flows at national level in Spain. I try to identify and face the methodological challenges that emerged when you have to apply these kind of methodologies at regional level. I do the calculations of these indicators, of the main indicators for the whole of the Spanish region. So I have 17 regional units for which I'm calculating the material flow indicators. And I try to identify which are the analytical issues which are specific to the subnational level. And one of these, among others, which I would like to highlight in this presentation, is interregional trade between the regions of a country, between Madrid and Catalonia, between Valencia and Murcia, between País Vasco and Extremadura, for example. And then I have tried to analyze the regional patterns of the outflows of emissions and waste, but as we will see later, it has not been possible, and I had to narrow the focus of the output side of the thesis. The structure is 5 chapters. We just passed the first one, and we're going to the second one. This is on the compilation and main indicators. Chapter 3 is on trade, specifically on trade. Chapter 4 is, it was supposed to be on outflows, on the whole of the outflows, but since there was no data on all the categories we needed for such an analysis, we have to narrow the scope, not by chance, since at ENT we are experts on municipal solid waste. We chose municipal solid waste at regional level as an issue to address, and chapter 5 will show some conclusions. So chapter 2, main indicators of regional material flows at regional level. The first thing you have to do is compile the data and calculate the indicators of material flows at regional level. This is quite intensive data-wise, and you have 2 main methodological challenges when you compare this to a national application of these indicators. The first one is you have to adapt some of the Eurostats. Eurostats is like Eurostat has a manual, a guideline, which is the standard, the harmonized worldwide standard of these accounts. We have other manuals that are pretty similar from the OECD, for example, but you have to adapt some of these points, which I think is not relevant now, but you have to take it into account. The main point, the main thing that is different is when you have trade between nations, you have international trade, and you have borders between these trades, and you have taxes. So it is more or less easy to register, but when you go within a nation and you have to go to interregional trade, you don't have taxes and you don't have this kind of information. So you have to compile a lot of data, basically data on each of the transportation types you have in your country, which in Spain are by boat, by pipeline, by plane, by train, by road, and you have to add them up and to some extent make sense of them and aggregate them in a way that is comparable to other studies. And this is quite a challenge, and it has been quite a challenge. If we had the previous scheme for the material flows overall conceptual framework, we have to adapt this to the regional level. And we have in a green color here, what is new, which is mainly you have to split imports and exports between those coming from the rest of the world and those coming from the rest of the region of the country you are studying. You can do it together for sure, but it is from an analytical point of view quite interesting to address them separately. And this is why we did these separate accounts, and we can have separate analytical insights for these realms, no? Of rest of the world and rest of the country. The main 4 indicators you have in the input side, is domestic extraction, which is what you take from your own territory. When you add up extraction to imports, both from the rest of the world and the rest of the regions, you have an indicator called domestic material input. There is an indicator called physical trade balance, which is calculated as imports minus exports. All of these accounts are in physical units, in tons. Okay, I didn't say that, and maybe it's interesting to note that, but it's in tons. Okay, so you have this physical trade balance. So if the physical trade balance is positive, you are a net importer of any kind of materials, and if it's negative, it means that you are a net exporter. And if you have domestic extraction plus the physical trade balance, which is domestic extraction plus imports minus exports, you have apparent consumption of materials of a territory. One thing that is not easy to understand, but you have to take it into account, is that I work with direct flows. What does direct flows mean? It means that you take when you calculate these indicators, you're adding up 3 categories of things that are a little bit different between them, and they are not homogeneous from a physical point of view. You have domestic extraction, which are raw material, which is wood, which is agricultural products, which is fish, which is metal ores, which is non-metallic minerals, which is fuels. And when you have to deal with interregional and international trade in this specific type of approach I'm using in my thesis, trade is registered as a mix of raw materials, semi-manufactured products, and manufactured products. So you're adding up in a way, wood with food with computers, for example, which is a clear pitfall of this methodology, and you have to deal with that. And we're used to do it, and it's well acknowledged, and we managed to have some analytical work on these accounts, even we have this this limitation. Okay, this is domestic extraction. Okay, you have here the figure on domestic extraction. I will be here for a little while because this one is interesting. This is the materials extracted in 96, in the year where the maximum of extraction during the housing bubble occurred in each of the autonomous communities, and the same value in 2010. If you can see here that what happened was a huge increase in extraction in all autonomous communities around 2007, at the same time as the housing bubble was at the peak, and then a decrease of extraction. This extraction in 96 was more or less dominated by construction minerals, but this trade is exacerbated in 2007 or around 2007. You can see it in practically all the autonomous communities, and then it gets reduced as the housing bubble stops. Okay, you can see also that I will read these conclusions now, but for example, biomass, the proportion of biomass in extraction is very different from one region to another, which is an interesting thing to analyze. So we can see here that we have a strong influence of the construction sector, which peaks around 2007. We can see it because we have an increase in construction minerals extraction. We can see that the share of non-metallic minerals in extraction is dominant, which is something is normal in developed countries, but it was quite exacerbated until 2007. That there is, within Spain, there is a coexistence of different extractive profiles between regions of Spain with high and low population densities. We can find Madrid with the lowest share of biomass, for example. It at the most is 7.3% of total extraction, whereas there are regions with lower population densities that have shares of biomass extraction close to pre-industrial metabolic regimes, which is Castilla y León, for example, where 45% of extraction is biomass, which means that something is happening here, then we will go into detail. Or Extremadura, well, 70% of what is extracted from the territory is biomass. We see that regions with a low population density, like Castilla-La Mancha, Castilla y León, Aragon, where agriculture has traditionally played a more important role in terms of gross value added and employment, showed the highest domestic extraction per capita. So here we have something interesting. So those regions where there is more space to extract resources, those resources are being extracted, and other places like Madrid with a high population density have lower extraction. So if they are consuming something in per capita terms similar between regions, you have to get these resources from someplace else, and you will guess from where it's coming. Also, 70% of Spain's biomass extraction, this is interesting as well because this is renewable resources, was concentrated in 5 regions. So we have 70% of all the biomass extracted in the country come from 5 regions. And this is Castilla y León, Andalucía, Castilla-La Mancha, Extremadura, and Galicia. And if we go to forest and fishing, we know that 30% of the extraction of these products come from Galicia. So there seems to be some kind of specialization pattern in extraction in Spain at regional level. Fossil fuels are irrelevant in Spain because we don't have fossil fuels. And once coal extraction was stopped due to climate-related policies, it became more and more irrelevant. We don't have metals in Spain. In fact, metal extraction in Spain collapsed by 2004, more or less. There are other type of extractions like construction minerals, which is present in all the regions of Spain, and other type of industrial minerals such as fertilizers or other kind of salts, etc., which is led by Cantabria, Valencia, and Catalonia, as you can see here as well. This one is difficult to interpret, so I will go to the three main points that you can extract from this one. Here you have separated between manufactured, raw, and semi-manufactured materials. For each of the regions, the accumulated physical trade balance. So what do each of the regions export and import? You can see it here. You can see it here. This requires quite a time to have an analytical view of this, but I can sum up with this I have written on the right side. Interregional trade is quantitatively more important than international trade, and this is one of the main contributions of my thesis. The amount of materials moved by interregional trade between the regions of Spain is more important in tons than international trade. And this has consequences, as we will see later. All regions, except Canarias, which is far in geographic terms from the Iberian Peninsula, are more closely linked to other Spanish regions than to the rest of the world. This means that all the regions, with the exception of Canarias, has more trade with other Spanish regions than with the rest of the world. And this is interesting in environmental terms as well, as we will see later. And in contrast with international trade, non-metallic minerals play a role in the sense that there are huge amounts of non-metallic minerals being traded between regions. Non-metallic minerals and construction minerals in particular have the feature of being cheap. So cheap things do not travel very far. So you will not see huge trade flows between countries, for example, between Spain and France, because it's too expensive to move them from Madrid to Paris, for example, or from Castilla-La Mancha to Paris. This is something that gets hidden in the national accounts. And once you open the black box of the regions of our country, you see that there is a huge amount of trade related to non-metallic minerals. And in this particular time span we are analyzing, which includes the housing bubble in Spain, it was quite important. Regarding, I see the zoom, I cannot see my, well, anyway. We can see in international trade that Spain relies on international import of fuels, mainly, and fuels come through the coastal regions because we have refineries there. And the same happened for metal ores. We are completely dependent on international imports of fossil fuels and metal ores. And you can see here how fuel comes to Andalucía, mainly, Asturias, Catalonia, Galicia, Murcia, and Región Valenciana, Comunidad Valenciana, sorry, because they have refineries. So fuels go to those places and then are redistributed across the rest of the regions. This graph is one of the main conclusions of my thesis. And on the left side, you have, this is net flows of construction minerals between the Spanish regions. On the left side, you have the origins, those regions that are giving resources to other regions. And on the right side, you have those regions taking, in net terms, resources from other regions. So you can call those on the left losers in environmental terms, because their resources are traveling to other places, so they get the environmental burden of the extraction of these materials, but they do not have, they don't use those materials. Those materials were given, mainly the top three losers in Spain during the housing bubble were Castilla-León, Castilla-La Mancha, and Murcia, and Aragon as well. And the top three winners, surprisingly, were Madrid, Valencia, and País Vasco, as you can see here. So this is one of the main points of my thesis. This you don't see this in nationwide studies of material flows because you don't see these flows, but there is an obvious trade of non-metallic materials, and in the context of the housing bubble, it implied a huge amount of trade, and it is supposed to have an environmental burden that is being taken from these losers and shifted from these winners, Madrid, Valencia, and País Vasco. Okay, the conclusions from this chapter are that we have found evidence that the construction sector dynamics and housing bubble had a strong influence on the regional metabolic trends because it conditions completely how the pattern performed. You have a lot of non-metallic materials extracted, you have a lot of trade of non-metallic materials, so there is a strong influence of this housing bubble. Something that happens with economic growth, or that is attributed to economic growth, is that you will, as you grow, you will be more efficient in terms of CO2 emissions per GDP and in extraction and consumption of materials in GDP, but it didn't happen in Spain. Between 1996 and 2008, a generalized rematerialization of the regional economies happened, and all of them grew in lost some kind of efficiency in material terms. So this is important because growth, economic growth, is supposed to have this this effect of improving efficiency, and in this case, in Spain, it didn't happen. We have found important difference across regions in domestic extraction per capita and domestic material consumption and in resource efficiency. And it was more pronounced in 2010 than they were in 96. So this contradicts in a way the hypothesis of the economists on this feature called convergence, which means if we all grow, we will be more similar to each other as we grow. But it was not the case in Spain, and in fact, the regions became more different as they grew through the housing bubble. And this is important because it contradicts one of the main regional economics hypotheses in place at the moment. And the more important one, I think, yes, somebody has the mic open.
Sergio, just you have 15 minutes.
Okay. That interregional trade is a crucial factor for identifying environmental pressures, given that the larger set of physical commercial exchanges occurred across regions. So, departing from this fourth conclusion, we decided that we have to go deeper on interregional trade. And this is why Chapter 3 addresses biophysical trade and environmental burden shifting at subnational level. I will go a little bit quicker. What we do with this chapter, we focus on the trade between the regions themselves, between, for example, Madrid and Valencia, Catalonia, Murcia, and between Madrid and the rest of the world. And I can see if, according to what the literature says, if you are a net importer of something, you are displacing the burden, the environmental cost of this extraction to those places where the resources are actually extracted. So we try to have a profile of the autonomous communities in order to know if, for example, Andalusia is being a net importer of these products or a net exporter, and in this sense, if they are being winners or losers in environmental terms according to their trade patterns. Okay. Here I have several slides showing that interregional trade grew more than extraction, international trade, and GDP for all the products we are addressing. Here's the growth per unit in percentage, sorry, and you see the green line being the interest. This is just to to demonstrate that interregional trade was a huge thing during the housing bubble in Spain. You can see it in agricultural biomass. The regional exports are the blue line. This is animal products. This is forest biomass. This is non-metallic minerals, when you can see how interregional trade was far more important than international trade. And I here explain the methodology, which is a little bit complicated, and I will not go into detail, but I just programmed a very simple algorithm to, according to the methodological limitations I have with my data, try to have a profile of the autonomous communities and put them a tag if they are winners, losers, importers, exporters of each of the products, of the main products of material flows. And here you have, for example, for agricultural biomass, M means importer, which means winner in environmental terms. X means exporter, which means loser. And the number you have here is a relationship between net imports or exports related to domestic extraction. And for example, if you go to Madrid, which is here, and you see agricultural products, you can see that Madrid is an importer in the interregional market, in the international market, and overall is a winner, is a net importer of agricultural products. And the size of this net imports is 3.3 times domestic extraction in Madrid, which gives magnitude of how Madrid is dependent on biomass from other places. The next one would be, I have these tables for all the materials, but I have focused on agricultural and non-metallic minerals here. And here you can see the same. Madrid is a net importer of these products in interregional. There are sometimes I cannot assign a tag because of the algorithm, but I can more or less profile the main trade roles of the Spanish regions in the interregional and in the international markets. The conclusions from this chapter is that given the magnitude of interregional trade, it can be considered a mechanism to displace the environmental burden of extraction across the subnational units of a country. So very plain, you can take advantage of being a high density population place and importing everything you need, you're going to consume from other places that will be taking the environmental consequences of extraction of those things you are going to consume in other place. We can see a specialization in raw material extraction and clear roles of winners and losers in each of the materials. Some of the regions are taking the environmental burden of extraction of certain materials, whereas other regions are successfully displacing the environmental burden of their consumption, and the most clear case is Madrid. Madrid is a clear winner of interregional trade. And in parallel to national income redistribution mechanisms, environmental burden shifting at subnational levels might call for an extrapolation of this concept to the environmental field. It means that it could be reasonable to design mechanisms, economic mechanisms, to compensate, mitigate, and restore the environmental burdens related to interregional trade. And I mean, for example, fiscal rules that obligates Madrid to compensate other regions for Madrid's environmental burdens through interregional trade. Chapter 4, I tried to do something with the output flows, but there was no data. So I focused on municipal waste. And what I did was, okay, we have this, I wanted to know how the regions were performing according to recycling of municipal waste, and we have this framework of the recycling target at 50% in 2020. We have already passed, but by the time I wrote this article, it was the target in place, and this target has to be achieved at autonomous community level. So that was an interesting playground to see how the different autonomous communities were performing. And how far or how close were the autonomous communities to achieve this target. I have here the regional performance in 2015, if I remember well. Practically all the regions were far from this target. A couple of them said that they were close, although we have some doubts on those data. But okay, this is in order to illustrate this figure, is in order to illustrate that there are very different performances across regions regarding recycling of municipal waste, as we have found for domestic extraction, for trade, etc. The methods I used was I plotted the information I had into ternary plots, and I will explain 3 of them. And we can see those are some triangles I will show right now. And we can see the combination of 3 main variables that establish management paths in terms of mixed waste, the proportion of mixed waste that has no treatment and goes straight to disposal, to landfills with no recycling at all, mixed waste that goes to some pretreatment and of which a little set is recycled, and the share of separate collection from which a large set is recycled. I will start with Andalusia, for example, which is the same. You can see a shadow here. The shadow means if the point is where you are at this moment, where Andalusia was in 2014, for example. If you want to, I will focus only on the gray area. If you want to accomplish the 50% recycling target, you have to put this point into the gray area, okay? In order to do that, you have to combine these 3 axes. I will explain here. MBT, which means mechanical biological treatment. D is disposal, direct disposal, and ST is separate collection. So you have to find, according to your technology, what combination of these variables allows you to accomplish this target. And in the case of Andalusia, we see that this point is going to get closer to the gray area, and the only way they have to get closer is decreasing the share of waste they are sending to MBTs, which means they have an overcapacity of MBTs. They will have to decrease the amount of waste going straight to disposal, to landfills, and they will have to increase a lot the separate collection of municipal waste. So in this case, we can see when you have here is close to 80% of the waste being sent to MBT, to mechanical biological treatment. So this region is clearly focused on recycling, or they have invested a lot of money in recycling mixed waste, okay? Here you have the case of Catalonia. You have the point much closer to the gray area, and they have to increase a little bit separate collection and decrease a little bit disposal in order to get to achieve the goal. This is a different situation because Catalonia has focused on separate collection instead of exclusively focus on the recycling of mixed waste. And you have the example of Madrid, which is focused on vertedero libertad, which means they have done nothing. We have practically no separate collection. We have a lot of disposal, and we have some mechanical biological treatment. So Madrid is really far from Madrid has not accomplished this target, but Madrid was really far because policy measures they have taken in terms of municipal solid waste management were null. There was nothing. So this is the result. They are really, really far from the target. This is a table of policies they will have to apply. I think it's not interesting now. And here is, I did some clusters in order to understand the strategies of the autonomous communities regarding municipal solid waste. We can see this, the circles here, cluster 1, they have a very huge share of municipal solid waste going to MBTs, to mechanical biological treatment. So they have invested a lot of money in trying to recycle a little bit of materials from mixed waste, which is something they have to reconsider now. There are cluster 2, which is Catalonia, Navarra, and País Vasco, which are more focused on separate collection, and they will have very likely better results in the short term. We have cluster 3, which is Aragon, Madrid, and I think this is Canarias, which are Vertedero Libertad, which they have done nothing. And we have the Balearic Islands and Asturias, that it's even worse than Vertedero Libertad, which is they have done absolutely nothing. in municipal waste management in the last, I don't know, 20 years. So some conclusions from the whole of the thesis is, the first is that the calculation of material flows at regional level is methodologically possible and analytically profitable. And I think the amount of information and conclusions we have demonstrates that. That economic growth led by the construction sector, as is the case for the period we studied in Spain, has a strong influence on the regional metabolic pattern of a country, and that the results are different as compared to other growth patterns registered in Europe, where material efficiency, emissions efficiency improves, and this didn't happen in Spain. We know now that very different metabolic patterns coexist within a country, and there's difference in material extraction and consumption were amplified. Instead of converging, there's difference were amplified during the economic growth period between 1996 and 2007 in Spain. We know that trade between regions of a country might be a major mechanism of environmental burden shifting, and we have demonstrated that for construction minerals, for example. We know that the Spanish regions play different commercial roles at interregional and international level, and that these roles might vary for different materials. We know that the trade of non-metallic minerals deserves further attention and analysis. That municipal solid waste management policies and recycling largely differ across the Spanish regions. That the regional environmental management in Spain, this is an overall conclusion I have from my thesis, is environmental management in Spain has occurred in the context of a worrying lack of data, because we have found severe data gaps when we have done these databases. That materials flows, if you perform material flows at a single scale, it might be analytically misleading, because if you calculate a given reference value, which is something everybody knows, this is not surprising, but this is something I want to stress. If you have the average for Spain, you might be missing a lot of information, and you might be representing nothing if you don't perform an analysis that is multi-scale and consider the implication of several scales. And I think the case of extraction and the case of interregional trade illustrates, and waste illustrates very well that data at only one scale might be something not quite useful for making environmental policies. So I hope you are all alive after the presentation and open to your questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. A very interesting presentation. Now we will open the floor. Please raise your hand if anyone has any question.
Don't be shy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You said that interregional trade has much weight, let's say, compared to international trade. I think I would like to know if you have, I don't know, an idea of what is happening in other European countries, in the sense that I know the situation a little bit. I didn't meet that kind of a study in Italy, but I know that really it's a really low the amount of resources that are coming from other region to other region. So the international trade, it's really high. So I would like to know if you have an idea what is happening also in other countries, because maybe superficially, I think that it kind of obvious thinking that if you can have some material resources inside the country, you are taking these resources from the other region, not from from other countries, internationally. So I would like to know if you have an idea of what is happening in other countries, for example, Netherlands, for example, that I know that they are importing everything. So just to have an idea of what is the difference between Spain and what is happening in other European countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rosaria. I mean, there is not a lot of data on that, as I said. Considering complete countries, there are only 3 papers, which is Spain, Czech Republic, and China. But there are several things we know because there are some studies for specific regions of specific countries. And there is several things you have to take into account. The first thing is the absolute size of the countries you are considering, because, for example, the Netherlands has the size of one of the little autonomous communities in Spain. So if your territory doesn't have the physical capacity to produce some products, you have to import them from other countries if you are a small country. And these are some dynamics that are well known by by regional economics, is the mainstream economics. I don't know the mechanisms. I mean, I don't think anybody knows very well the mechanisms for the allocation of resources, but one thing we know, and one thing we can know and we can extract from national analysis, is that the higher the population density, the higher the material dependency on other territories. And high population density tends to occur in small places. That's the case of Madrid, that's the case of the Netherlands, and that's the case for, I don't know, Hong Kong, for example, or islands. That's the case for islands, for example. For Italy, I don't know what is the situation, but I think it's very much conditioned by the type of access they have to see, the geographical form, and the size of the country. So there are several situations, and a country, it has to do with the extension of the country. And for example, in France, I don't know how it works, but it has to do with the importance and the administrative relevance you give to subnational units. And for example, if you go to the United States, and I don't know if it's fair to compare interregional trade between the states of the United States, because one state of the United States is as big as Spain. So, I mean, the physical size of countries and the physical size of socioeconomic and socio-ecological systems has to be considered. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maria, please.
Yes. Well, I would like to, first to say that I have, I think that it's a very good presentation, and that your thesis for me seems very interesting. And I would like just to make I would like to say that the last part that you have presented regarding this methodology to distribute the position where each regional, each community is situated regarding their treatment, their situation on separate collection or MBT or disposal. I think that this methodology could be, once you have presented your thesis, presented or in the ministry or a ministerio or in each regional authority, because I think that it's a good it could be a good tool for them to use to calculate the effort they should do in each kind of installation, or each kind of plant, just for them to plan, to help them to plan the effort on each kind of treatment to reach the objective, the overall objective, European objectives. No.
I think so. I mean, it's a very clear way of showing it can be a municipality, it can be a country, it can be a region. You can show them where they are and what they have to do, and it's very, very clear.
Yeah.
My experience with Ignace as well is that it was difficult to build up this model, and it remains a little bit difficult to communicate this model. Sometimes it's because it has a lot of nuances and a lot of things you have to consider. And even if it published, I shared it with the ministry, I guess, and I'm not sure they understand the content of this. So we have to improve communication of this model. But I agree that this is very, very simple, because you show this point, you show an area, and you say your possibilities are this. You have to do either this or this or this, but you have to do something. To me it's pretty clear, and that was one of the strong points of the
maybe as you say, maybe you have to ask the way to show it better, to explain it better for them to be understood, and well, for me it's a good tool. It's very clear for me.
We have tried to present this to some authorities, but I think we have to improve that dimension of communication.
Well, and good luck for your final presentation.
Thank you.
Now it's the turn of Veronica, please.
First, thank you for the presentation. I think it was really interesting, and it came to many nice ideas came up. But I have a question on how the 4 chapters or the 3 chapters, main chapters, come together. Like it's really clear that in the first 2 there are like winners and losers, and then in the place in the chapter with the recycling rates and how they behave in the situation of the different clusters. I wanted to ask you if you see some relation between clusters and losers and winners. So like, are they somehow, can you see a trend, or the cluster performing the worst are the losers in the other parts of the?
I don't think so. I don't think, in fact, there is a huge step between input and output flows, and the fact that I have to focus on municipal waste makes it very difficult to have integrated conclusions on the performance of the regions, because you don't have, I mean, the rules governing the input flows are very different to the rules governing the output flows. We have a lot of regulation regarding the output flows, and we have some regulation on the input flows as well, but it's different, and there's more tradition on the output flows, for example, having targets and everything. But when you look at this kind of frameworks, you realize that we have paid a lot of attention to the output flows because it's more evident, I guess, the environmental consequences of the output flows, and that the rules governing the output flows are more easily accepted by the parties, by regions, countries, etc. But when it comes to, for example, negotiate international trade or interregional trade, the rules governing these flows are very different, and even extraction is very different to regulate or to drive to other type of dynamics. This makes that when you analyze both flows, even if you have all the information for the output flows, you don't see this parallel performance between what happens on the input side and what is happening in terms of winners and losers. Although there is an overall trend saying that if you are taking the burdens of extraction, you are taking a huge part of the outflows. For example, in mining, waste from mining, you have the impact from mining and you have the waste from mining as well. So in this sense, there is a parallelism, but it's difficult because we have paid much more attention to the output flows from the regulation side than to the input flows. And I'm pretty sure it would be a very tough one to have some additional regulation or economic compensations regarding trade, which is something, it's a claim from political ecology of the last 20 years.
Can I have another question? Because another point that I saw is like, I don't know if I missed the point, but you have found that there is more trade interregional in Spain than internationally. And if we apply, like say, assume that, and you say that the environmental load of this trade in the interregional would be higher in amounts than in the international trade. But if we assume that we avoid the distances, we can say that this makes more sense for the environment. If we can trade internally, we shouldn't go to trade internationally for the environment, right? So one thing is on the amount of trade, no, tons moving around, no, and this is more important. Like but for me it makes sense. I don't know if you agree with this or not.
I don't have, I mean, you are thinking from the perspective of an integrated assessment of the environmental impacts in your case. These indicators, and I write a lot about what's the meaning of these indicators in environmental terms. The final question is, does these tones mean something to somebody? Because I don't have it, I mean, I don't see the point in adding up tones of things and saying that if you import more than you export, you are performing worse than others. I mean, I get your point, and I completely agree that it's not a matter of tones of things, and it might be something more important. But in the literature, it's one of the hypotheses with as people working on material flows. In general, those people taking the burden, not the CO2 for transportation, for example, but if you have coal mines, as in China, you are taking the environmental burden of this extraction. Or if you are in India, for example, and you have bauxite, you are taking the environmental burden of that extraction. And this is something that it's yours. And I mean, or for example, if you are Aragon, or you are Castilla-La Mancha, and you are extracting non-metallic minerals to be sent to Madrid, why you should be taking that, and why Madrid is not compensating Castilla-La Mancha for having that? Is the market allocating this kind of environmental burdens? Obviously, the market is not doing that because it's not programmed for that. But that's the question. The question is, I don't know if it makes sense to, probably it doesn't make sense to bring any kind of construction materials from France. But does it make sense that Castilla-La Mancha has to suffer the environmental burden of the housing bubble in Madrid or Valencia? Should we compensate them?
Thank you, Sergio. We have one last question from Miquel.
I think somehow there are two parts on the question. One, I think it's very linked with what you have just been talking about. You have stressed a lot in your presentation the idea of compensation and environmental impact, but I think you cannot claim that you have done an environmental impact assessment. So in this sense, I think you should be much more cautious with this idea, because I mean we have been talking about international and national, but we can also argue that in some cases, in some regions, there will be some trade-offs between materials, and you have not evaluated which is on the impact of each of them. So you cannot say you have to establish compensations or not. No? So I mean, just a point of warning on that, because I think it should be for sure. At least you should be prepared when you present your PhD, because that would comes for sure. These comments, I think, and I think it's fair. I think it's fair because you also have not, for example, in trying to understand which are the different impacts on the different technologies. I mean, this is something, it cannot be done because it's too much work, but at least it should be recognized. No? And my question is the second one, which is, at which extent do you think that this sort of material flow analysis can be linked with more an industrial flow analysis? No? Saying, for example, I mean, in the housing bubble that you have mentioned, it is very clear because there's only mainly one material, no? Which is non-metallic materials, which are minerals, which are linked with this sector. But what about the other sectors? I think, for example, the car industry or other issues as all the petrochemical industry, etc., where usually you use other techniques, no? As in more the industrial metabolic systems, and trying to close the loops, the material loops, etc. So at which extent do you think that you can mix both techniques, the techniques that you have used and the techniques that you are usually using in industrial ecology flows analysis? Because I think it will be very interesting, and it will be a very interesting contribution to see how the economic sectors are linked with the different territories and the flows that are moving into internally. But I don't know if it's feasible or not.
Okay. Regarding the first part of the question or reflection, I absolutely agree. And in fact, more than half of chapter focus on trade is a reflection on precisely everything you were mentioning, but I skipped this in the presentation because I didn't have time. But it's quite a methodological and a conceptual article in the sense that I have had to split materials per categories in order to compare. And one of the questions I come up with is it, why are we compensating, for example, when we do it, and you know, in the literature, you usually do an aggregate of everything. And if you are a country like Chile, for example, exporting a lot of things, and then you are a loser, and you are supposed to be burdened by other countries, and you are a global loser. That's more or less okay, but I don't think it makes any sense out of the political interpretation of material flows. I mean, it doesn't have any environmental interpretation that is convincing at the moment, unless we agree on a disaggregation of materials that is, in fact, environmentally relevant. And what I do in my thesis is doing these physical trade balances for specific materials. For example, for fishing, I know the fish balances of the autonomous communities, for forest biomass, for agricultural biomass, for animal products, for non-metallic minerals, under the hypothesis that these categories are more or less homogeneous in terms of environmental, and I say burden. And I have a reflection on what impact, pressure, all these terms are very well defined and very well established in the literature. And we have the Debsir model, the IPAT formula, and people working on material flows, we are not being consistent with those concepts. So we have to refer to something which has a more political implication, which is burden, and we have to try not to get in the mood of impacts and everything that is measured in other way. So
maybe my suggestion, if you have been thinking about it and you think you have achieved to get some improvement on the discussion, then I suggest you just to use some minutes to do the to put it in the presentation if it's valuable enough, because it will be fair that somebody will ask for you, and it's much better if you have already
think
about it to put it.
This presentation is not meant to represent what I will present in the thesis, because
just a mention, because it will come for sure.
And I think it's going to be one of the core points of discussion. In fact, my point with this article is, hey guys, if you are doing material flows, you may not be measuring nothing related to the environment. You're measuring other things. So be careful, and let's try to be consistent with the terms we use and what we are doing with these accounts, because we are trying to make these accounts relevant for policy making, and at the same time, we are jeopardizing this possibility by not being consistent with the thing we are trying to represent. So are we saying something by adding up tones at one scale? This is one of the, I know, for example, Mario Gianpietro is going to be very happy to listen this kind of reflection from somebody working on material flows. Are we doing something relevant if we study aggregated flows in tones for one scale? I think it has a political, not a policy, but a political implication, but it hasn't a very relevant environmental implication. This is one of the points, because I'm somehow criticizing my fellows on material flows, but I think it's fair to do this critique, and this is something that has to be faced if we want to become relevant, and we are relevant now with, for example, Eurostat's accounts on material flows, and we are the reference for circular economy policies now. But we don't know what we are measuring, and we usually tend to make our conclusions bigger than they are in analytical terms. And this is something we have to nuance and to take into account every time you do material. And I do, in the thesis, I do a compilation of people misusing and misunderstanding impact, pressure, and everything, and using it with different senses in the same text. And I think this critique is fair. After this conceptual note, which is super boring, the other thing you were talking about, Mikel, was about compensations. Sorry.
It was about the possibility of linking the methodology that you have used on materials with a more other sectoral approach that is very much linked with closing the loops, etc. No, I think it will be very interesting to try to.
As it happens with nationwide approaches, regions are black boxes, and for regions, what happens within the region is a black box. So you need an additional tool to unveil what is happening. And in this case, I would say that through material flow analysis, you will have the big picture of a region, which when you have the region and the nation, you have two scales and you have something you didn't have before. But if you want to go in detail, this is raw material equivalent analysis based either on substance flow, if you are interested in one specific substance, or going to input-output tables and go and see what's happening between sectors of an economy. But the type of studies you can do with one database as mine is the big picture of a region, that if you put it in the context of other regions, you have some analytical space. And if you have the whole picture of the nation, you have two scales to compare. So you have some analytical play there. But if you want to go deeper in detail of sectors in particular, you have to go to input-output tables. This is the limit of this data. And we have to say it as well, because sometimes people think that this data serves for everything, and it's not the case.
Okay, thank you, Sergio, for your explanations. We will leave it here. From my side, just a quick reminder of the next session we will have. It will be on the 20th of May, again at 12 o'clock, and we have the pleasure to have Professor Emeritus Joan Martínez Valier. He will be talking about circularitat, entropia, conflictes ecològics i combustibles incremables. He will be speaking in Catalan in the next session. And that's all. Thanks, Sergio, and congratulations for the presentation. And you have a very good luck in the presentation of your thesis. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.